When we think of the Spanish Empire, we picture galleons groaning under the weight of silver, conquistadors claiming continents in the name of the crown, and a flag that once flew over more territory than any empire before it. From the plains of the Americas to the Spice Islands of the Pacific, from the Low Countries to the Italian peninsula, Spanish power seemed to touch nearly every corner of the known world. For nearly 2 centuries, Spain was the wealthiest state on earth, drawing an ocean of precious metal from mines that no other civilization had ever controlled at such a scale. Contemporary observers marveled at it. Foreign ambassadors wrote home describing warehouses in Seville stacked floor to ceiling with silver ingots, and rival monarchs eyed Spanish wealth with a mixture of envy and dread. And yet, this same empire, despite commanding more gold and silver than any state in human history, collapsed under the weight of its own debts, not once, but again and again, in a pattern so persistent that economic historians still study it as a case study in how not to run an empire. Today, we explore one of history's greatest paradoxes: how the richest empire on earth went bankrupt. The story is not simply one of greed or mismanagement, though both played their part. It is a story about the strange and often destructive relationship between sudden wealth and long-term stability, about how an empire can appear all-powerful on the surface while rotting from within, and about how gold and silver, the very things that built Spain's global reach, ultimately became the instruments of its financial ruin. To understand how this happened, we have to go back to the very beginning, to a moment when Spain was not yet an empire at all, but a patchwork of rival Iberian kingdoms with no obvious destiny to rule the world. Spain's rise did not begin with wealth. It began with unification, and unification itself was the product of centuries of slow, grinding conflict. For over 700 years, the Iberian Peninsula had been divided between Christian kingdoms in the north and Muslim states in the south, a long and often violent coexistence known as the Reconquista. Castile, Aragon, Leon, Navarra, and Portugal each pursued their own ambitions, sometimes allying, more often fighting one another as fiercely as they fought the Moorish kingdoms to their south. There was, for most of this period, no such thing as Spain, only a shifting mosaic of crowns bound loosely by language, faith, and geography. That began to change in 1469, when Isabella, heiress to the throne of Castile, married Ferdinand, heir to the throne of Aragon. The marriage was as much a political calculation as a romantic union, joining two of the peninsula's most powerful crowns without formally merging them into a single state. Castile and Aragon would continue to have separate laws, separate parliaments, and separate administrations, but their rulers now shared a common cause. That cause found its defining moment in 1492, a year that would prove to be one of the most consequential in world history for reasons far beyond Iberia itself. In January of that year, the joint armies of Ferdinand and Isabella accepted the surrender of Granada, the last Muslim stronghold on the peninsula, bringing the Reconquista to its triumphant close after nearly 8 centuries. The fall of Granada was celebrated across Christian Europe as a victory of civilizational proportions, and it gave the newly joined Spanish crowns both a sense of divine mission and, just as importantly, a battle-hardened military class with nothing left to conquer at home. Thousands of soldiers, minor nobles, and adventurers who had spent their lives fighting on the Iberian frontier suddenly found themselves without a war. It was this same restless, ambitious class of men who would soon look westward across the Atlantic for new frontiers to conquer. That same year, only months after the fall of Granada, Isabella agreed to finance an ambitious and, to most experts of the time, faintly ridiculous proposal from a Genoese navigator named Christopher Columbus. Columbus believed he could reach Asia by sailing west, a plan most contemporary scholars considered wildly optimistic given their reasonably accurate estimates of the Earth's circumference. Isabella's decision to fund the voyage, over the objections of several royal advisors, would turn out to be one of the most consequential gambles in history. Columbus never reached Asia. Instead, in October 1492, he stumbled onto islands in the Caribbean, encountering a hemisphere that virtually no European power yet understood or even knew existed. Within a generation of that voyage, Spain would control territories stretching from the Caribbean basin deep into the mainland of the Americas, laying the foundation for an empire built on a combination of religious conviction, martial ambition, and an increasingly insatiable hunger for gold. The Treaty of Tordesillas, signed in 1494 and brokered by the Pope, divided the newly discovered lands between Spain and Portugal along a meridian line, granting Spain rights to the vast majority of the Americas. On parchment, in the stroke of a papal pen, Spain had been handed a claim to half the unexplored world. Turning that claim into actual wealth and control, however, would require conquest on a scale no European power had previously attempted. The first waves of Spanish expansion into the Americas were modest, focused on establishing footholds in the Caribbean islands of Hispaniola, Cuba, and Puerto Rico. These early colonies produced some gold, extracted through brutal forced labor systems imposed on the indigenous Taíno population, but nothing on a scale that could transform Spain into a global power. That would change dramatically in the 1520s and 1530s, when Spanish expeditions encountered civilizations far wealthier and more organized than anything they had previously found in the islands. In 1519, a minor Spanish official named Hernán Cortés defied his own governor's orders and led an expedition of roughly 600 men into the interior of Mexico. What he found astonished him. The Aztec Empire, centered on the magnificent island city of Tenochtitlan, a metropolis larger and more populous than most cities in contemporary Europe, with causeways, canals, and markets that left Cortés's own soldiers writing home in disbelief at its scale and sophistication. Through a combination of ruthless diplomacy, alliances with rival indigenous states who resented Aztec domination, devastating European diseases that swept ahead of his army, and outright violence, Cortés brought down the Aztec Empire by 1521, seizing control of one of the wealthiest civilizations in the Western Hemisphere. Just over a decade later, a former swineherd turned conquistador named Francisco Pizarro achieved something even more improbable. Leading a force of fewer than 200 men into the heart of the Andes, Pizarro exploited a brutal civil war within the Inca Empire, capturing the Inca ruler Atahualpa at Cajamarca in 1532. Atahualpa, in a desperate attempt to buy his freedom, offered to fill a room with gold and twice more with silver, a ransom historians estimate would be worth well over $100 million in modern terms. The Spanish accepted the ransom, melted it down, and executed Atahualpa anyway. By 1533, Pizarro's forces had captured Cusco, the Inca capital, and the empire that had once stretched along the length of the Andes mountain range collapsed into Spanish hands. These conquests delivered staggering quantities of already accumulated gold and silver into Spanish coffers almost overnight, treasure that had been mined, crafted, and hoarded by these civilizations over generations. Ships loaded with looted Aztec and Inca gold began crossing the Atlantic, and for the first time, ordinary Europeans began to grasp the scale of wealth that lay across the ocean. But the treasure looted from these fallen empires, however immense it seemed at the time, was ultimately a one-time windfall. It was not what would make Spain the wealthiest power in the world for the next century and a half. The true prize, the one that would define Spanish fortunes for generations to come, was not the gold already sitting in Aztec temples or Inca palaces. It was what lay beneath the ground the Spanish now controlled. Both Mexico and the former Inca territories sat atop some of the richest mineral deposits ever discovered by any civilization in human history, deposits of silver so vast that their exploitation would reshape not just the Spanish economy, but the economic system of the entire world. Spain had inherited kingdoms, cities, and captive labor forces. It was only beginning to discover that it had also inherited mountains made, quite literally, of silver. In 1545, somewhere high in the Andean Altiplano of what is now Bolivia, a group of Spanish colonists learned from local Quechua and Aymara informants of a mountain unlike any other on Earth. Local legend held that the mountain had once been claimed by the Inca themselves, who had begun mining it before a mysterious voice, said to emanate from the mountain, warned them the silver was destined for other hands. Whether or not the Inca ever seriously worked the site, the Spanish who arrived in 1545 had no hesitation. They named the mountain Cerro Rico, the Rich Mountain, and it would prove to be one of the most staggering mineral deposits ever discovered in human history. A single peak containing so much silver ore that it would fund the ambitions of a global empire for the better part of 2 centuries. Around the mountain rose the city of Potosí, a settlement that within decades grew to a population rivaling the largest cities of Europe. A startling fact given its location over 4,000 meters above sea level, in thin, freezing air, far from any coastline or major river. By the late 16th century, Potosí had become one of the largest cities in the entire world. with a population estimated at well over 150,000 people at its peak, larger at the time than London, Madrid, or Rome. Merchants, miners, clergy, and adventurers from across Spain and its colonies flocked to the city, drawn by a simple, brutal promise. The mountain never seemed to run out. Extracting that silver, however, required labor on a scale that could not be met through voluntary means, and the system the Spanish crown implemented to solve this problem became one of the darkest chapters of the colonial era. Building on pre-existing Incan labor traditions, Spanish authorities formalized the mita, a system of forced rotational labor that compelled indigenous communities across a vast region of the Andes to send a designated portion of their male population to work in the mines each year. Conditions inside Cerro Rico were horrific. Miners descended hundreds of meters into narrow, poorly ventilated shafts, working by candlelight, breathing air thick with toxic mercury vapor used in the refining process, and carrying ore loads up ladders carved into solid rock. Mortality rates among Maitea laborers were catastrophic, and historians estimate that between the mines of Potosí and the associated processing operations, millions of indigenous workers died over the roughly 3 centuries of Spanish colonial mining, whether from accidents, disease, exhaustion, or mercury poisoning. Alongside Potosí, a second equally transformative silver deposit was being developed far to the north, in the region of Zacatecas in present-day Mexico, discovered by Spanish prospectors in 1546, just a year after Cerro Rico itself. Zacatecas and the surrounding mining districts of New Spain would go on to rival and at certain points exceed the output of Potosí itself, giving Spain not one but 2 massive independently operating silver-producing regions on opposite ends of its American empire. Together, these 2 mining complexes would come to produce the overwhelming majority of the world's silver supply for well over a century, a concentration of mineral wealth in the hands of a single state that had no precedent in prior world history. Extracting silver from the ground was only the beginning. Getting it safely across an ocean infested with pirates, privateers, and rival naval powers required an entirely new kind of logistical infrastructure, and the system Spain developed to manage this became known as the flota, or treasure fleet system. Twice each year, heavily armed convoys of galleons would depart from ports in Veracruz and Cartagena, converging in Havana before making the long Atlantic crossing to Seville, the single port legally authorized to receive American treasure. Each fleet could carry hundreds of tons of silver at a time, escorted by warships specifically tasked with protecting the cargo from English, French, and Dutch raiders who prowled the Caribbean and Atlantic shipping lanes hoping to intercept a single fortune-making prize. The scale of silver flowing into Seville was almost impossible for contemporaries to comprehend. Registered shipments alone brought hundreds of tons of silver into Spain annually during peak years, and historians estimate that unregistered, smuggled silver may have added significantly more on top of official figures, as merchants and officials alike sought to avoid the crown's substantial tax on precious metal, known as the quinto real or royal fifth. This silver did more than simply enrich the Spanish crown directly. It flooded outward into the broader European economy, financing wars, paying foreign bankers, purchasing military supplies from Italian and German manufacturers, and eventually funding luxury goods imported from across the known world. Remarkably, Spanish silver did not stop at the shores of Europe. Beginning in 1565, Spain established a second, equally ambitious transoceanic trade route, this time across the Pacific, connecting the silver mines of Mexico to the Spanish colonial outpost of Manila in the Philippines. The famous Manila galleons, sailing annually between Acapulco and Manila, carried American silver westward to purchase Chinese silk, porcelain, and spices, which were then either consumed in the colonies or shipped back across Mexico and the Atlantic to Europe. So much Spanish-American silver flowed into China through this route that some economic historians estimate a substantial share of all silver ever mined in the Americas during the colonial period eventually ended up in Chinese hands, absorbed into an economy that prized silver as its primary medium of exchange. For a brief, glittering period spanning the late 16th and early 17th centuries, Spanish silver had effectively become the reserve currency of the entire connected world, linking Potosí and Zacatecas to Seville, Antwerp, Manila, and Beijing in a single unbroken chain of commerce. By the time Philip II ascended to the Spanish throne in 1556, the empire he inherited from his father, Charles V, had already become the largest the world had ever seen, and under Philip's reign it would reach its widest territorial extent. Spanish holdings stretched across the Iberian Peninsula, much of Italy, the wealthy provinces of the Low Countries, vast stretches of the Americas from California to the southern tip of Chile, and the Philippine archipelago on the far side of the Pacific. It was said, with only slight exaggeration, that the sun never set on Spanish territory, a boast that would later be more famously applied to the British Empire, but which was first, and arguably more truly, earned by Spain. Spanish military power during this period was equally formidable. The tercios, Spain's elite infantry formations combining pikemen, swordsmen, and early firearms troops in disciplined, mutually supporting units, were widely regarded as the most effective land force in Europe for well over a century, remaining largely unbeaten in major pitched battles from their emergence in the early 16th century until their eventual decline in the mid-17th. Spanish naval power, though it would later suffer the famous and humiliating defeat of the Armada in 1588 against England, nonetheless controlled the shipping lanes of the Atlantic and much of the Mediterranean for generations, and Spanish and Allied fleets delivered a crushing victory over Ottoman naval power at the Battle of Lepanto in 1571, a victory celebrated across Catholic Europe as a triumph of civilizational proportions. To contemporaries observing from London, Paris, or Vienna, Spain in this era appeared not merely powerful but genuinely unstoppable, a superpower possessing seemingly unlimited financial resources, an effective global monopoly on New World silver production, elite and battle-tested military forces, and a self-declared religious mission to defend and expand Catholic Christianity against Protestant reformers to the north and Ottoman power to the east. Spanish ambassadors were received with a mixture of respect and barely concealed anxiety in courts across the continent, and rival monarchs openly worried in private correspondence that survives to this day about Spain's capacity to simply outspend and outlast any single rival through the sheer weight of American treasure. And yet, even at this moment of apparent invincibility, when Spanish power seemed to radiate outward with no obvious limit, the financial foundations beneath this glittering imperial facade were already far less solid than they appeared from the outside. The empire's rulers, dazzled by the seemingly endless flow of silver arriving twice yearly from across the Atlantic, had begun to make a set of assumptions about the durability of that wealth that would, within a matter of decades, prove catastrophically mistaken. Beneath the glittering surface of Spanish imperial power, cracks had already begun to form, and they had been forming for longer than most contemporaries realized. The fundamental problem was not a lack of income. By any measure, Spain in the second half of the 16th century commanded resources that dwarfed those of any rival European state. The problem was that Spain's rulers, and Philip II above all, had come to believe, whether consciously or not, that American silver represented a functionally infinite resource, one that could be drawn upon indefinitely to fund whatever military or political ambition the crown chose to pursue. This assumption proved to be one of the most consequential miscalculations in the history of state finance. Philip II inherited not one war, but a tangled web of overlapping conflicts, and rather than choosing among them, he attempted to fight nearly all of them simultaneously. In the Mediterranean, Spain confronted Ottoman naval expansion, a struggle that culminated in the great victory at Lepanto in 1571, but that continued to drain resources for years afterward in the form of fortifications, galley fleets, and garrisons across Spanish holdings in Italy and North Africa. In the north, the Spanish Netherlands, among the wealthiest and most economically productive territories in Philip's entire empire, rose in rebellion in 1566, beginning what would become the 80 Years' War, a conflict that would consume Spanish treasure and Spanish soldiers for generations with no decisive resolution in sight. Simultaneously, Spain found itself drawn into confrontation with England, culminating in the disastrous Armada campaign of 1588, and intermittently at war with France over rival claims to Italian territory and religious influence within the fractured French kingdom. Rather than treating incoming American silver as a resource to be carefully husbanded, invested, or used to build durable domestic economic capacity, the Spanish crown treated it essentially as a solution to whatever immediate crisis presented itself. Silver arriving in Seville was, in a great many years, already spoken for before the ships had even completed their crossing, committed in advance to paying soldiers in Flanders, provisioning garrisons in Italy, or servicing loans taken out months or years earlier. Rather than investing this wealth into domestic industry, agricultural modernization, or infrastructure that might have generated sustainable, renewable sources of revenue independent of the mines, the crown spent it almost as quickly as it arrived, and often considerably faster. Spain became, in effect, addicted to a revenue source it did not fully control and could not reliably predict from one year to the next, since the arrival, size, and safety of each treasure fleet depended on weather, distant mining conditions, and the ever-present threat of interception by hostile fleets. To bridge the gap between when money was needed and when American silver actually arrived, the Spanish crown turned increasingly to a system of short-term borrowing that would come to define and ultimately undermine its entire fiscal structure. These loans, known as asientos, were typically provided by powerful banking families, first the German Fugger and Welser banking houses during the reign of Charles V, and later, increasingly, by Genoese financiers who came to dominate Spanish court finance through the latter half of the 16th century and beyond. In exchange for immediate cash, often needed urgently to pay restless troops or cover pressing military expenses, these bankers received the right to be repaid from specific future shipments of American silver, along with substantial interest. This arrangement created a deeply dangerous financial cycle. Because the Crown routinely needed funds well before any given treasure fleet actually reached Seville, it became standard practice to borrow against silver that had not yet been mined, refined, or shipped, sometimes against multiple future fleets at once. Each new loan carried its own interest obligations, layering debt upon debt in a structure that left the Crown perpetually behind on its commitments, no matter how much silver ultimately arrived. In good years, when treasure fleets arrived on schedule and in full, this system merely limped along, straining but functioning. In bad years, when a fleet was delayed by storms, intercepted by English or Dutch privateers, or simply produced less silver than anticipated due to declining ore quality or disruptions at the mines themselves, the entire elaborate structure could seize up virtually overnight, leaving the Crown unable to meet obligations to soldiers, suppliers, and creditors across multiple fronts simultaneously. Compounding the problem, the Spanish Crown's revenue streams were deeply uneven across its own territories. Castile bore a disproportionate share of the direct tax burden financing the Crown's wars, since Aragon, Catalonia, and other component territories of the composite Spanish monarchy retained separate legal privileges that limited the Crown's ability to tax them as heavily. This meant that even domestic Spanish tax revenue, collected largely through a tax on internal sales transactions known as the alcabala, could not by itself come close to covering the Crown's military expenditures, leaving American silver and, increasingly, borrowed money against future silver to fill an ever-widening gap between income and ambition. The inevitable consequence of this borrowing structure was default, and Philip II's reign would become infamous for a pattern of sovereign bankruptcy without precedent among the major powers of early modern Europe. In 1557, only a year into his reign, Philip suspended payments on the Crown's outstanding debts, an event that sent shockwaves through the European banking system and contributed directly to the collapse of several major German banking houses that had overextended themselves lending to the Spanish Crown. Remarkably, this was only the first of many such episodes. Philip defaulted again in 1560, again in 1575, and once more in 1596, a pattern of repeated sovereign bankruptcy occurring roughly once per decade throughout his 42-year reign, despite presiding over what was, on paper, the wealthiest state in the world. Each of these defaults functioned, in essence, as a forced renegotiation. Rather than an outright refusal to ever repay creditors, a Spanish bankruptcy typically involved converting short-term, high-interest asiento loans into longer-term government bonds known as juros, which carried lower interest rates and extended repayment schedules. This allowed the Crown to continue functioning, and allowed at least some creditors to eventually recover a portion of what they were owed. But it devastated confidence in Spanish credit and ruined the specific banking houses caught holding short-term obligations at the moment of default. The 1575 bankruptcy in particular proved catastrophic for many of the Genoese and other Italian banking families who had come to dominate Spanish court finance, and it took years for the Crown to rebuild sufficient banking relationships to resume large-scale borrowing. What made the Spanish pattern so remarkable, and what continues to draw the attention of economic historians today, was its sheer persistence across generations of rulers. The pattern did not end with Philip II's death in 1598. His successors continued essentially the same cycle of borrowing against future silver shipments and defaulting when circumstances turned unfavorable, with major state bankruptcies recorded again in 1607, 1627, 1647, and 1653, spanning the reigns of Philip III, Philip IV, and into the early years of Charles II. No other major European power of the period broke its financial promises to creditors so frequently while simultaneously being regarded, at least in the popular imagination of the era, as the wealthiest and most powerful state on the continent. The paradox at the heart of Spanish power was becoming impossible to ignore, an empire drowning in silver and yet perpetually, structurally, unable to pay its own bills. The flood of American silver did not simply finance wars and enrich the Spanish crown. It set off a chain reaction across the European economy so profound that economic historians would later give it its own name, the Price Revolution. As silver poured first into Spain and then, through spending on wars, imports, and debt repayment, into the wider European economy, the sheer quantity of precious metal in circulation began to outpace the supply of goods available to be purchased with it. The basic logic was simple, even if contemporaries did not yet have the economic vocabulary to describe it clearly. More money chasing the same amount of grain, cloth, and livestock meant that prices for those goods had to rise. And rise they did, dramatically and relentlessly, across the 16th and into the 17th century. Grain prices in Castile are estimated to have risen several 100% over the course of the 16th century alone, with similar or even steeper increases recorded in various regions across the wider European economy that absorbed Spanish silver through trade. A Spanish scholar of the period, Martín de Azpilcueta, working at the University of Salamanca, was among the first to articulate what we would now recognize as an early quantity theory of money, observing directly that the increased abundance of gold and silver in Spain had made goods more expensive precisely because money itself had become more abundant relative to the things it purchased. It was, in essence, one of the first clear real-world demonstrations of monetary inflation ever documented, playing out on the grandest possible scale. The tragedy, from Spain's perspective, was that this inflation struck hardest and first within Spain itself, precisely because Spain was the initial point of entry for American silver into the European economy. Wages, prices, and the cost of raw materials in Castile rose faster than in neighboring economies such as France, England, or the increasingly commercially sophisticated Dutch provinces, since Spanish silver had to physically travel outward from Seville before it diffused across the rest of the continent, giving other economies a crucial lag during which their own domestic prices remained comparatively lower. This meant that, ironically, the empire's single greatest resource, the silver that made Spain the envy of every rival power, actively worked to erode the competitiveness of Spanish domestic production relative to its neighbors, a slow-moving economic poison operating quietly beneath the surface of apparent imperial splendor. As inflation drove up the cost of producing goods within Spain itself, a second, closely related problem began to compound the damage. With silver arriving in such tremendous quantities, it became simpler and often genuinely cheaper for Spanish consumers, merchants, and even the crown itself to purchase manufactured goods from abroad, rather than invest in developing or protecting domestic industries capable of producing them. Textiles from Flanders and later England, fine manufactured goods from Italy, and a wide array of specialized products from across the continent flowed into Spain, purchased with American silver almost as quickly as that silver arrived from the Atlantic crossing. Spain increasingly came to function not as a producer within this expanding global economy, but as a conduit, a channel through which wealth passed rather than a place where wealth was generated through domestic industry and labor. Silver flowed in from Potosí and Zacatecas, and it flowed almost immediately back out again, whether to pay foreign bankers servicing crown debts, to purchase foreign manufactured goods, or to pay foreign mercenary soldiers increasingly relied upon to fill the ranks of Spanish armies as domestic recruitment struggled to keep pace with the empire's sprawling military commitments. Contemporary observers, including several Spanish economic writers of the period known as the Arbitristas, wrote at length lamenting this exact phenomenon, warning that Spain was becoming, in the words attributed to one such commentator, poor precisely because it was rich, its domestic economy withering even as unimaginable wealth passed continuously through its ports. This underlying industrial decline was made considerably worse by a series of demographic and social disruptions that further eroded Spain's productive capacity. Plague episodes recurring throughout the late 16th and 17th centuries reduced the available labor force in key regions. Continuous warfare drew men away from agricultural and artisanal work, and into military service, often never to return. And in 1609, King Philip III ordered the expulsion of the Moriscos, descendants of Spain's formerly Muslim population, who had nominally converted to Christianity, but remained a distinct and, in certain regions, economically vital community, particularly skilled in irrigation agriculture and specific craft trades. Their forced removal, estimated to have affected some 300,000 people, devastated agricultural production in regions such as Valencia and Aragon, where Morisco labor and expertise had been especially concentrated, further weakening precisely the kind of productive domestic economic base that might otherwise have provided Spain with income independent of its increasingly unreliable American silver shipments. The empire, in short, possessed the treasury of a superpower while increasingly operating with the industrial and agricultural base of a far poorer, more fragile state. If inflation and industrial decline were slow, corrosive forces working beneath the surface of Spanish power, the direct cost of continuous warfare was the far more visible and immediate drain on Spanish finances. And it was a drain that showed no signs of easing as the 17th century progressed. The 80 Years' War against the rebellious Dutch provinces, which had begun under Philip II in the 1560s, ground on with only intermittent truces well into the 1640s, consuming staggering sums to maintain garrisons, fortifications, and field armies across the Spanish Netherlands, one of the most expensive and logistically demanding theaters of operation in the entire empire. This burden grew heavier still with Spain's entanglement in the wider European conflict known as the 30 Years' War, beginning in 1618 and eventually drawing in nearly every major power on the continent. Spain committed enormous resources to supporting its Habsburg relatives in the Holy Roman Empire, maintaining what became known as the Spanish Road, a critical overland supply corridor running from Spanish territories in Italy, through Franche-Comté and Lorraine, up to the Spanish Netherlands, allowing troops and treasure to move without exposure to hostile naval interception in the English Channel. Maintaining this corridor, along with the armies that depended on it, required a continuous and enormous outlay of silver, year after year, with no end to the conflict in sight for 3 long decades. Simultaneously, Spain maintained substantial military commitments in Italy, defending Habsburg interests in Milan and Naples against French ambitions, while also garrisoning territories across the Mediterranean and maintaining fleets to counter both Ottoman naval power and increasingly aggressive raids from Barbary corsairs operating out of North African ports. Each of these fronts individually might have been manageable for a wealthy state operating with reasonable fiscal discipline. Maintained simultaneously across multiple decades, funded increasingly through short-term borrowing against silver shipments that were themselves becoming less reliable, they proved to be a burden that no quantity of American treasure, however impressive on paper, could indefinitely sustain. Military overreach, the stubborn insistence on fighting every war simultaneously, rather than choosing which conflicts truly served Spanish interests, had become not merely a strategic habit, but the defining and most ruinously expensive feature of the entire Spanish imperial project. While Spain poured its American silver into an ever-expanding web of simultaneous wars, its rivals were quietly building something Spain itself had never managed to develop: a financial system capable of surviving without depending on a single, unpredictable stream of precious metal from across an ocean. The Dutch Republic offers perhaps the most striking contrast. A territory with a fraction of Spain's population, no significant mines of its own, and a hard-won independence still being contested on the battlefield, the Dutch nonetheless developed institutions of state finance that proved remarkably resilient. The Amsterdam Exchange Bank, founded in 1609, provided a stable and trusted foundation for commercial credit. Dutch provincial and municipal governments issued long-term bonds at comparatively low interest rates to a broad base of domestic investors who trusted they would actually be repaid, a trust that Spanish creditors, after decades of repeated defaults, could simply no longer extend to the Spanish crown. The Dutch East India Company, chartered in 1602, pioneered joint stock ownership structures that allowed enormous commercial ventures to be financed by spreading risk across thousands of investors rather than depending on the fortunes of a single royal treasury. England, too, though it would not fully develop its own sophisticated system of public credit until the founding of the Bank of England decades later, in 1694, was steadily building a more commercially oriented economy less dependent on the fortunes of any single overseas treasure fleet. French finances remained troubled throughout much of this period in their own right, but France possessed a far larger domestic population and tax base than Spain, giving French monarchs a broader and more sustainable foundation for state revenue, even amid their own periodic fiscal crises. The consequences of this widening gap became starkly visible on European battlefields. At the Battle of Rocroi in 1643, French forces inflicted a decisive defeat on the famed Spanish tercios, shattering the myth of Spanish infantry invincibility that had held for well over a century. It was not merely a single lost battle. It was a visible, undeniable signal, watched closely by every court in Europe, that the military instrument which had once made Spanish power so formidable had been worn down by decades of continuous, underfunded, overextended warfare, and that Spain's rivals, better organized financially if not always militarily superior in raw numbers, were increasingly capable of matching and beating an empire that had once seemed unbeatable by definition. Compounding every other pressure bearing down on Spanish finances was a problem that no amount of administrative reform or military restraint could have solved. The mines themselves were beginning to fail Spain precisely when it needed them most. Silver production at Potosí, after decades of intensive extraction using the mercury amalgamation process introduced in the 1570s, began a long, uneven decline through the early decades of the 17th century, as the richest and most accessible veins near the surface were progressively exhausted, forcing miners to dig deeper at greater cost and with diminishing yields to reach ore of comparable quality. Mexican mining centers experienced their own fluctuations, offsetting some of the decline from Potosí, but never fully compensating for it at the scale Spain's expenses demanded. At precisely the moment when silver output was becoming less reliable, the costs of extracting, refining, and transporting what remained were rising. Deeper shafts required more extensive timber supports, more elaborate drainage systems to manage groundwater, and ever larger quantities of mercury, itself an expensive commodity shipped from mines in Spain and later Peru, to process lower-grade ore. Piracy and smuggling, meanwhile, continued to divert an unknown but almost certainly substantial share of silver away from the Crown's official registered shipments, silver that reached private hands, foreign competitors, or simply vanished from any records the Spanish treasury could rely upon for its own planning. Colonial administration itself grew steadily more expensive as the empire matured, with an expanding bureaucracy, growing fortification networks, and larger colonial garrisons all drawing on revenues that the mines were producing in ever less abundant quantities. The Spanish crown had, over the course of nearly a century, built its entire fiscal identity and strategic posture around the assumption of an essentially endless river of silver flowing across the Atlantic twice each year. That river was not endless. It was, by the middle decades of the 17th century, visibly and measurably slowing, even as the empire's accumulated debts, standing military commitments, and administrative costs had grown to a scale that assumed the river would keep flowing at its former extraordinary volume indefinitely. The gap between what the empire needed and what its mines could actually deliver had never been wider, and unlike a battlefield defeat or a diplomatic setback, it was a gap that no treaty, no victory, and no clever financial maneuver could close. By the closing decades of the 17th century, under the long and troubled reign of the sickly Charles II, the last Spanish Habsburg monarch, Spain had become, in the assessment of many historians, a shadow of the power it had been only a century earlier. It still held vast territories across Europe, the Americas, and the Pacific on paper, and it still retained a certain ceremonial prestige as one of the oldest and grandest crowns in Christendom. But financially, it was exhausted. Industrially, much of its domestic productive base had withered under a century and a half of inflation, war-driven demographic loss, and neglect in favor of imports purchased with silver that had itself become increasingly scarce. Politically, the Crown's credit had been damaged by repeated bankruptcies to the point where securing new loans required ever more desperate terms from an ever-shrinking pool of willing creditors. The lesson embedded in Spain's long decline endures precisely because it runs so thoroughly against ordinary expectation. We tend to assume, almost instinctively, that a state possessing unprecedented natural wealth, wealth on a scale no rival power could match, should be virtually guaranteed lasting strength and security as a result. Spain's history demonstrates, in vivid and repeated detail across more than a century of sovereign bankruptcies, runaway inflation, industrial decay, and relentless military overreach, that this assumption does not hold. Sudden, immense wealth, when it is extracted rather than earned, and when it is spent on the immediate demands of continuous warfare rather than invested in the kind of durable domestic economic capacity that sustains a state through lean years, does not guarantee lasting power. It can, under precisely the wrong set of institutional habits, become the very mechanism through which an empire consumes itself. Spain did not fall to a single decisive military defeat, nor to a single catastrophic financial collapse that historians can point to as the definitive end. It fell gradually, unevenly, across generations, worn down by the compounding weight of choices made at the height of its power, when an apparently endless river of silver made it seem as though no cost was ever truly too high to bear. The empire that commanded more gold and silver than any state before it in human history ultimately became a cautionary tale precisely because of that treasure, a demonstration, still studied by economists and historians today, that the river of silver which built an empire could just as surely become the current that carried it, quietly and inexorably, toward its own financial ruin.